Hey everyone, good evening and welcome to another one of our semi-regular D&D streams. So tonight we're going to be talking a little bit about creating horror content. Why horror content? Well, because it's Halloween coming up, and this being the month of Spooktober, seems like a great time as any to talk about my design process as well as um, what I normally do when it comes to writing horror stories that will not just engage and excite but also give you the chills when you're playing. So what's the horror genre? Horror genre is something that's definitely going to be very exciting to talk about for me because it's one of my pet genres when it comes to film studies. So I think I've told quite a few people before about my background as a writer. I actually majored in film, and one of the topics that I specialized in was films in Asia, so Asian cinema, and one of the genres that I studied for Asian cinema was, of course, horror films because Asia's really got a good handle on horror, especially in terms of supernatural and psychological horror. So let's talk a little bit about the elements that make up the horror genre. So I'm just gonna start with that. So let's see if you can see that. Yeah, so these are some of the things that blend together to make up horror. So what is horror as a genre? So first and foremost, horror is really split into three simple, I guess, pillars, if you want to talk about that. And the first thing about the horror genre is that as a genre, it's content, it's stories, it's films, it's movies, it's TV series, whatever, any type of content, any type of art, any type of creative work that elicits, a sense of dread, a sense of fear, and there's a shock factor for the audience. Yeah, and of course, as part of this genre, one of the most important things about this genre is that it's all about creating this impending sense of doom, this sense of dread through the use of atmosphere. It's about designing your environment, designing your sets, designing the world in which your story revolves in, and using all other elements of that, be it music, be it the aesthetics, be it the props, or the design of your surroundings. And this must be done in such a way that it's constantly going to put your audience on edge. It's constantly going to give your audience the jitters. And the most important thing about horror is that there must be a threat. There must be some sense of danger. There must be this something high stakes that the participants, that the characters in the story, that the players of your adventure, they have something to lose. And most times in horror stories, it's about the loss of life, because if you get caught by the killer, you're dead, right? Or if you get attacked by a monster and you're eaten by the monster, you're dead. So bad stuff happens. So these three pillars define the horror genre. So just to do a quick recap, it must be able to elicit fear. It must be able to elicit a sense of dread. The atmosphere matters, and the atmosphere matters greatly because everything about the genre comes from the atmosphere, be it the costumes, be it the sets, be it the props and displays. And of course, there must be a threat, and this threat must be very real. It must be something that the characters must confront in the story, and there must be stakes involved. There must be something that they can lose. Yeah, so this is horror genre as a loose category, as a loose definition. And I'm gonna talk a little bit as well about the subgenres of horror. So these are sub-themes in the horror genre, and these are going to be a good way, a good entry point for you if you are planning to write your own D&D stories. So I'm just going to touch on them very briefly. One of my favorite aspects of horror has always been psychological horror. And this is I would say this is a type of storytelling that focuses on the mental states of the characters. And there's often a lot of suspense in the stories because it plays upon your senses. It plays upon the characters' suspicion, their distrust, their fear, their paranoia. There's often some very unreliable narration. The characters have a very limited point of view, and there are often many things that are unknown to the characters. And psychological horror is great because it creeps up on you. It's not something that's really in your face, so you don't get all too many jump scares. You don't get gory, ugly monsters, but rather the fear and the sense of dread, the sense of doom. It's palpable because the characters and their constantly shifting mental states play into that. And you as the audience, you as the reader, you as a person playing the adventure, you may be thrust into such a similar position as well. Another subgenre for horror is, of course, killers. So there's either a serial killer or someone stalking your character, or there might be some sort of survival style scenario. Yeah, and the biggest threat here is, of course, the threat of death. Your character gets killed off, and well, you die. That's the end of the story, right? Of course, the primary antagonists for a killer genre typically they're mortal antagonists. They might be pretty tough. They might be hard to put down, but they're primarily mortal. They are not supernatural in that regard. But we are talking about D&D after all, and we can expect some degree of magic to be involved in the storytelling. Yeah, and of course, if we are looking at other subgenres, there's monsters, and these are often the more macabre or unsettling creatures. And these can be vampires, werewolves, zombies. These are very fairly common in horror stories. Like you could have a zombie outbreak in a remote military outpost. You could have vampires stalking people in the forest. You could have werewolves, or other sorts of mythological creatures, like maybe a kelpies. Kelpies, pulling people into the water and drowning them in a seaside town, for example. So these are monsters, and a lot of this, a lot of the horror of monsters, a lot of the revulsion of dealing with monsters comes from the appearance of the monsters. So a lot of this comes down to the way the monsters are designed. And in D&D, we have a whole bestiary of monsters we can use. Yeah, and of course, there's a supernatural element as well for horror as a subgenre. And this supernatural element often involves things like ghosts and spirits, hauntings in haunted houses, for example, um, people getting possessed, or devils and demons, very commonplace. They're everywhere. If they're not fighting the blood war in the nine hells, they're or on the first layer, they're probably doing something sinister with cults, and there might be practitioners of magic like cultists. D&D has adventures that are basically a cult a week, right? So it's fairly commonplace. And of course, supernatural genre, there's often this element of magic involved. So one of the good examples of a horror subgenre is, of course, in Asian cinema, we have Hong Kong cinema. And in Hong Kong cinema, we talk about, say, Chinese vampires. So there's a good degree of supernatural element to that. There's often a practitioner of the magic arts, a Taoist practitioner or a monk who uses chants and sutras to exorcise ghosts and spirits. And there's often some degree of conflict involved as well because of the hauntings. Or if you want to talk about Thai horror, Thai cinema, there's often a very supernatural bent to that because they tap a lot upon their folklore and their superstitions. And that is, supernatural horror as a subgenre for you. Yeah, Bowmongs as well. Bowmongs definitely. So a lot of Southeast Asian content as well. There's always this talk about witch doctors, some degree of superstition. They may have things like curses, or some sort of magic spell that they use to ensorcel and enchant people, right? So So that's one of the things that happens in the supernatural genre for horror. And yeah, so these are some of the horror subgenres that I've been looking at, and I think that they're a great starting point for D&D. So if you are maybe, writing a D&D adventure, yeah, horror in space is doable. Maybe not so much in D&D because it's fantasy setting, but if you want to write sci-fi, I would say that's entirely possible as well. Uh, One of my favorite sci-fi movies, I would say, that touched upon horror was Event Horizon. Now that was a cult classic, and I think that if we're gonna chat about, say, how it's done, how the scares are designed, how it's created, there's a lot of psychological elements in it, and that's one of the best things about it. It plays a lot upon the I would say the characters and their fears and the sense of isolation and sense of dread because they're in outer space. And in fact, if you have been playing video games, well, one of the more popular video games last year was Among Us, and Event Horizon and Among Us have very many similarities, I would say, and that's great. So does anybody have any horror projects they're working on so far? Yeah, Eldritch horror is one of the more fun and interesting elements as well, especially in D&D. If you are, working with creatures such as the illithid, the mind flayers, right? Or if you're talking about beholders and other aberrations, there's a bit of eldritch horror to that. And Lord of the Mysteries is an amazing series. I have to say, I was blown away when I read the web novel, and I gotta say, it's probably one of the best written Chinese web novels ever, right? And guess what? They're actually gonna be making an anime out of that, and BC May, which is a great production studio, is working on that. So I'm really looking forward to catching that when it becomes available on Bilibili or whatever, right? So that's one of the cool things about the horror genre as well. You spawn all sorts of interesting amalgamations. In fact, horror can have so many elements, thrown into it, and you can always mix and match. So if you want to do something with psychological horror, with maybe killers and monsters, that's great as well. If you want to have some supernatural elements, you want to have a supernatural killer, go for it. If you want to have a supernatural monsters, supernatural monster hunters, that's great too. And I mean, if you look at the current storylines in Adventurers League, we have things like Ravenloft Mist Hunters, which has some horror elements. I would say that it's a little horror light, but then again, I don't scare easily. So I guess um, the kind of horror that you're thinking about differs from person to person, right? So it's really hard to say. But yeah, so horror subgenres, I think I've covered that. It's not too heavy, I hope. And I'm gonna just move on a little bit, and I'm gonna talk a little bit about how you can start writing your own horror adventures. And right now, I'm gonna just share 5 tips. These 5 tips are, things that I've discovered while I was writing horror stories for D&D. I've written quite a few mini adventures for D&D that are horror based. Not all of them for 5th edition, um, but of course the latest one being the Waystop. And I think that the most important thing about understanding horror stories is that you want to have interesting and compelling characters. Yeah, and this is helpful for the players, especially because you will be encouraging the players to empathize with these characters. You want the players to get a sense that these characters are interesting to them. These are characters that they can feel for. These are characters that they want to protect, they want to see survive the adventure. So write compelling characters. So write characters that they can be sympathetic to, so that the characters can empathize with with the characters, the NPCs. Also, write characters that the players absolutely hate. So that's even better, because if bad stuff happens to the characters that they hate, to the NPCs that they dislike, it's even more cathartic for them as well, right? So they can enjoy, or rather they can make a memorable moment out of it, out of the fact that these characters, these NPCs that the players dislike, had bad stuff happen to them. Yeah. So remember when writing NPCs that you probably want to think about how they feel, how they think, how they act. What are their motivations? What do the NPCs want? What do they hope to accomplish? Do they have something in their immediate future that they're looking forward to? So that when that gets taken away, it becomes all the more interesting for the players, right? It becomes all the more compelling for the players. So that's about writing compelling characters in a nutshell. So just a quick recap. Basically, think about who the NPCs are, what do they want, what their motivations are. Is there something that they want to look forward to? Is there a particular way they behave? Do they have a memorable way of speaking? Do they have a memorable style of dress? What are their personalities like? So perhaps you have an incredibly annoying jock type character, a very gung-ho, very brash, very loud and obnoxious person, or perhaps a very timid, very shy person who's an NPC. So think about it. Build characters that are likable and interesting, or if they're completely unlikable, like I said, they must have something that makes them memorable in the eyes of the character. So bad stuff. So if bad stuff happens to them, it's great. Yeah. So that's how it can. That's how you can create fun characters, fun and interesting and versatile characters. And of course, another thing to think about is to write what's familiar to you. So I don't know, I don't know about, you know, what you dislike or what you're afraid of, but I know I really, really dislike bees. I really, really dislike bean sprouts. And when I was a kid, I had this unnatural um, phobia about butterflies because of this. There was this Chinese TV drama series, and there was this episode where butterflies would just congregate on people and just strip all the flesh from their bones. And that was really scary for me as a kid. And if you want to write horror, the best kind of horror is really, writing about something that you already know intimately, that you're afraid of, so that so I guess, your experience will be quite authentic, and it would kind of be more accurate when you write about it. So if this is something you're scared of, and you know how you feel about it, there's no better way. Yeah, and yeah, that sounds great actually. Green Hag, reflavored as a Malayan spirit. That's perfect. Um, yeah, so write about things that scare you, because that way you can make this connection as a writer. Yeah, and that's gonna be really helpful as well, because when you want to write something that is familiar to you, you probably have a lot more knowledge. You're not going to be whiffling around and trying to figure out, what's the next step, because you actually kind of know what exactly you're writing. So that's really helpful. And let's see what's next. Use and subvert genre conventions. So when people participate in a horror adventure, or if they read a horror story, or if they watch a horror movie or play a video game with horror elements, they're really there with certain expectations. They're already there with they've come in with some expectations. You know, they come into horror because they know exactly that they want to be scared, right? So it's pretty much something that you would hope to achieve when you're participating in a horror story as well. You know, you want to be scared. And there are certain genre conventions, certain tropes, I would say, in storytelling that would really, really matter. So definitely something that you want to use as an author as well. What are some typical horror conventions, horror genre tropes? Um, I would say things like there's always one person who heads off on their own and always somehow or the other just dies, right? And that's always within the first 15 minutes of the adventure of the story. Yeah. So there's also always something called death flagging. So if someone ever talks about, say, you know, but they're gonna go home to their family, they have a daughter waiting, and they take out maybe a pocket watch with a picture of their daughter inside, and just gush on and on about their daughter, chances are that that character is gonna die. Or if someone says, hey, you know, I'm gonna go back to my hometown and get married to my childhood sweetheart, that's death flagging as well. You know that this person is probably going to get killed off somewhere in the story. They're not going to survive to the very end, right? So yeah, so that kind of makes sense. Death flagging, death flagging is one of my favorite, I guess, you know, writing conventions and writing techniques to use as well. Yeah. So if you think a little bit about it, there's always a lot of genre conventions you can utilize. So write what is expected by the audience. So that's really really helpful for that. It's one of the things to think about. One other thing that might prove to be a great genre convention as well is that there's always gonna be couple-ish characters, and typically if the couple goes off somewhere to have a bit of quiet time together, they usually don't come back. Horror stories, right? Typically that happens. So yeah, so write what is familiar and use what is familiar to you. Yeah, that's true. There's always some random drunk, or at the 11th hour, there's always some savior that comes by. In a lot of horror stories and a lot of movies, especially, there's always a cop at the 11th hour. You know, there's always a police sheriff in a police car, or the detective that appears at, say, the last 30 minutes of the film. They just pop out, you know, with their vehicle, and chances are those characters may die, but the important thing is that the vehicle remains, right? So that's the escape vehicle for the characters. So if you want to talk about, say, a horror story where, you know, they have to survive, there's always some sort of vehicle that appears, or some sort of conveyance, some way for them to escape from the horror. So that happens as well. Yeah, and if we're talking about haunted houses, it's always the really, really cheap but fancy looking house, you know. And yeah, the blinds are always a good addition, and it's always great because you always have characters that see things behind the blinds, or characters are peeking out through the blinds into the courtyard, and then they see something strange, right? So that's a genre convention as well. So these are the kind of conventions that you can use to help, you know, tell a better story. And if these are things that are well respected as part of the storytelling tradition for for horror stories, might as well use them. There's no reason not to use them because they are already familiar with people. Yeah, so the next thing I'm gonna just chat a little about as well um, would be the concept of pacing. So pacing is pretty important in horror as well. You don't want to fill the entire sequence of, you know, events, the entire story with jump scares upon jump scares upon jump scares upon jump scares. Because you kind of want to create a good mix of highs and lows in your storytelling. You want the players and the audience or whoever you're writing for to have a good sense that you're building up. You're building up to the horror. So you start with maybe a little bit of creepy music. You start with a little bit of a little bit of atmosphere. You start by describing the scene when you're writing an adventure. You start by telling people about what your surroundings look like, how dilapidated the house is, how run down it is, how there's this attic with a window that seems to be boarded up. You start by describing the surroundings, the environment, and then you build up to maybe one or two scares and then pace that out. So there's some good highs and lows. There are some cheap thrills as well as the big payoff at the end. So pacing is really important. You don't want to have too many scares back to back. So I would say in a good adventure, perhaps if you're writing horror adventures, you want to have the scares as the highlight of each scene. Yeah, so that could work out. Because if you have too many jump scares or too many scares in general, it just cheapens everything. And yeah, so looking at chat right now, I'd say orphanages are a great setting for a horror story, especially if you're also talking about a magical world, a magical setting where orphanages might be a place where unscrupulous magic users who have sponsored the orphanage might use to harvest experimental subjects, and that might result in some lingering malice or lingering spirits or unhappiness once the orphanage is abandoned. So that's actually an interesting concept you can use, and it's a very, very standard, very tropey, very typical concept, and it kind of works. Yeah, religious sites are great too. Religious sites are excellent. In fact, in Chinese storytelling, in Chinese adventure stories, I would say there's a very particular genre of tomb raiding in Chinese history, in Chinese storytelling, that takes place maybe around the turn of the century. And there's often a lot of supernatural elements involved. You have people delving into old abandoned tombs from the Qin dynasty or from the Tang dynasty or whatever eras from the past. And there are often traps, there are often supernatural elements, there are often spirits and undead. And there's always this sense that it's more than just an adventure. There's a lot of Chinese folklore involved. Yeah, the Chinese grave robbing series, Damu Biji was very popular. Gravekeeper's Notes, I think, or Grave Robber's Notes. And there's another one called Gui Cui Den, which is I think Ghost Candle something or the other. I can't remember the exact translation for that, but it's really popular as well. And these two are some of the most defining series in terms of grave robbing literature from the Chinese writers, and they're great. And they are excellent for horror as well, because there's a lot of interesting horror elements. Yeah, so it's really cool. So that's something to think about. Yeah, Ghost blows out the light. Yeah, that's quite interesting. It's basically a literal translation. So yeah, and let's talk a little bit about consistency as well in terms of your writing and your world building. I think this is pretty essential. If we're talking about creating horror stories for D&D especially, because we are talking about writing adventures, one of the most important things that you need to definitely think about is how everything functions in the D&D universe, in the D&D world. Because let's not forget that D&D takes place in worlds where magic is involved. There's a lot of spellcasting, there's a lot of supernatural elements. And if you want to think about consistency, you need to think about how the horror works in this setting. Like, what's so scary about ghosts and spirits when you can get clerics to turn undead and exorcise them and stuff like that, right? So think about how that works in the setting. Think about how the overall world view of your horror story is going to be like, and how you can adapt that for your storytelling. So that's essential. And also think about how the characters, how the players who are involved in the story, as well as the NPCs that are involved in the story, deal and relate to the horror. How do they handle, the supernatural elements? How do they handle the people coming after them if they are like ghosts and spirits or zombies or whatever? How do they handle all these things? Like, is there a ritual that they can conduct towards the end of the adventure, taking into consideration all the lore all around? Yep. So definitely something about taboos as well. That's true. In fact, a lot of horror stories are cautionary tales. So they're usually used to remind people about religious or supernatural traditions and beliefs. And in your setting, in your story, in your world, or in Forgotten Realms, for example, if you chance upon a desecrated tomb, or if you were the characters who desecrated the tomb, or let's take one of the Season 10 Dungeoncraft story seeds, for example. Perhaps the players or a group of adventurers before the players had chanced upon a sacred Goliath burial site, and they decided to take away all the treasures, and that's bad stuff, right? Yeah. So think about how it works in the world, in the setting, and how you can create a believable story around that. So you have to be consistent in terms of the worldview, in terms of how your story relates to the overall setting as a whole. Like, if it takes place in the Moonsea region, if it takes place in Icewind Dale, or right now, if it's going to bring you to the Feywild in the current Dungeoncraft modules. What kind of taboos are there? In fact, the Fey are excellent sources for horror stories. If you think about it that way, the Fae can be very punitive and very vindictive. So that's an excellent concept, an excellent opportunity for you to work with for your storytelling in Season 10. So if you break contracts, or if you do perhaps something that's very discourteous to the Fae, or even something as simple as mispronouncing the Fae's name, or even thwarting the Fae while they're doing something mischievous, you could attract a lot of their ire, and there could be some supernatural, some horror element to that. So if you think about it, I would say, maybe Rumpelstiltskin is a very well-respected, folklore kind of fairy tale kind of thing, right? So everyone knows about Rumpelstiltskin. And Rumpelstiltskin is a good example of a Fae creature, and of doing something punitive with the Fae. So that's entirely possible. And if you play up the supernatural elements, it could be incredibly horror-inducing as well. This could be quite terrible and frightening. The Pied Piper is a great example. Why? Because the Pied Piper was offered, recompense, and there was some issues with that, because the townsfolk were not very forthcoming, and of course the Pied Piper took revenge by taking away the children. So it's about honoring your contracts. So that kind of works very well in the Feywild, in the Fey concepts for Season 11 as well, and that's perfect. That's amazing. The Ice Queen is definitely also a very, very Fey focused kind of story. and it can be quite fascinating as well. It's good material. So yeah, definitely lots of things to think about. So these are some examples of more, I guess, children's tales. Monkey's Paw is great. Yeah. Being careful about what you wish for as well, and subverting wishes. So that's really really helpful. I'm not too familiar with Jin stories, I would say, but I wouldn't be surprised if there were some. And because a lot of these concepts, a lot of these ideas are all, I would say, quite universal. Like I said, they're all mostly cautionary tales. One thing about, I would say, Chinese folklore as well. There's often talk about how, uh, you know, there are certain taboos to follow, like say during the seventh month, do not disrupt the paper offerings, or if you were to say if you were to entreat the spirits, and you ask them to assist you in certain endeavors, you are supposed to make good on that, and to make the necessary offerings and ablutions as well. So again, you see, there's a lot of things about contractual obligations, and that really works and really comes into play. Yeah, so some of them, of course, are not so much horror stories per se, but maybe if you think about it, there are ways to remind people to be careful, like going to watery areas at night. That's probably to warn you about the dangers of drowning if you go swimming late at night, because you can't see whether there are any obstacles underwater, or there might be currents that are very strong, and you might get sucked underneath and you get drowned. Yeah, so that's entirely possible. Faust was an excellent story, in a sense that it was a cautionary tale about hubris, right? And about making pacts with the devil. So there's many many elements that you can draw inspiration from as well. So yeah, so let's jump quickly into the next part of what I was going to talk about. I was going to talk a little bit about the Waystop, which is one of the stories that I wrote some time ago. And hello, welcome. Good to have you with us. We're just chatting about writing at horror adventures right now, and great to have you. So the Waystop was one of those little things that I decided to work on when I was kind of bored. I was thinking a little bit about telling a horror story. That time when it was going into publication was somewhere along October as well. So I was working on that, planning to release a horror story at a time, and yeah, so that was one of those little things, and the way stop was pretty fun for me, all things considered, because of the very many elements that I could play with. So I'm just gonna share a little bit about the Waystop manuscript. I'm gonna talk a little bit about that as we go, and if you haven't played it before, it's available on DM's Guild, and you can just grab a copy of the Waystop whenever. It's also unfortunately gonna be a little bit of spoilers when I talk about it, because I can't really highlight some of the examples without talking about spoilers, right? So please bear with me, and yeah, I mean, I hope that we get a good opportunity to discuss the manuscript as we go along. So first things first, the way stop was, I guess, inspired by a couple things. So one of them being Hotel California by the Eagles. So that was really really something that I was thinking about for quite a long time. And yeah, wow, that sounds kind of cool. So writing stuff up, you know, trying to come up with horror tropes. That's always fun. What kind of horror stories were you doing for your homebrew adventure? Hmm. All right. That's a very diverse party. So I guess that's kind of decent. Was it just for 3 players? No, 3 players. Great. Yeah, it seems like your sounds like your players would have had a lot of fun, I guess. That's cool. And definitely, I think if you were gonna be doing a horror story, having a good cast of players and their characters, as well as NPCs to liven things up, would make for a really excellent kind of campaign. Yeah, and that's what I was thinking when I was doing the Waystop, in fact. So the Waystop was designed with the whole idea of the players arriving at a rather dilapidated, isolated place in mind. So as you can see, this is the cover, and like just now when I was mentioning something about environment design, about how the atmosphere is really important. Uh, the cover for Waystop really kind of sets a scene. When I designed it, I said, hey, I really want to bring to the fore the fact that this is a place that's really isolated. It's really out of the way. It's raining. It's gloomy. It's all sorts of miserable in terms of the weather, and the players are forced to come to this place. They are stuck here. They're all travelers, and I'm glad to say that the artist that I gave the commission to really came through with the environment design for this. So we have a great cover, and this is a great way to set the scene. So, so this is the blurb, and like I always encourage writers, if you can try your best to sum up your story in about 1 paragraph or so. Tell people what they need to know about the adventure, the who, what, where, when, why, and how. It's kind of like writing, uh, a log line for a script or something, or writing a blurb for a news article. Yeah. So try to describe as best you can what the players can expect, and this really helps to push your adventure forward because if you can summarize, if you know what exactly you're talking about, chances are the DM or whoever's going to be running the story for you uh, is probably going to be able to get a grasp of that from your log line, from your blurb, and that's going to be helpful because it sets up all the expectations as you go along. So there we go. So this is where we're going to start with the Waystop. Yeah, and if you can, and I'm just going to very quickly talk about some of the genre conventions that we use for that. So as you can tell, this is about a dark and stormy night. We're gonna start with that. So that's one of the typical genre conventions you'll see in horror, right? Where maybe a group of travelers or someone's car breaks down along the highway, and they realize that, hey, I'm not gonna get any help here. I'm not gonna get a tow truck to come over to pick me up, and to bring my car to the nearest garage. So you're gonna need to go find shelter, especially if a storm is coming, or if you need to go find help from one of the houses nearby. And this very common horror trope was what I decided to use as the starting point for the Waystop. So we have a bit of background. So this is an old abandoned town. Bad stuff happened. I'm not gonna go too much detail into that. Um, but basically, it's a cursed place. It's not a very lucky place. It's not a very fortunate place. And as travelers heading towards this place, unceremoniously stuck there because of the rain, you're stranded, and at the same time you encounter several other travelers, several NPCs, each with their own secrets at the Waystop. So that's one of the ways that I decided to use tropes to start this off. And this adventure flowchart, I'm just gonna scroll through this real quick. So yeah, so looking at the Waystop, one of the ways that I tried to tell the story, how I tried to design the environment and the setup, was to also pick a place in the Forgotten Realms that had a very inhospitable terrain. And that really helps a lot because having this inhospitable terrain, this makes it really hard for people who are stuck there to find help. Makes it very unlikely for other travelers to come by to bail you out. So you're forced to be a bit more resourceful, and the sense of isolation as well plays towards the horror because you know that you're stuck here. You need to survive by your own wits as a character if you're playing this adventure. So there's a bit of description here. So you can see here when we're trying to build up the scene, you really want to talk about the surroundings. You really want to bring this out so that you can convey the sense of desolation, the sense of abject isolation in this part, how dilapidated everything is. So we have things like crumbling masonry, rusted iron fences. We talk about the boggy ground. This is really quite important as well, just to lay the groundwork so people kind of know what kind of terrain, what kind of environment they're in. And of course, things like rotten timbers, overgrown timbers, stuff like that. These are great elements, very, very evocative. So if you as a DM, if you're reading through this, you can either paraphrase this or use your own words. Or if you like to read from the text, you can read a little bit from the text, work it into your narrative. It helps to paint the scene for your players in their imaginations. And of course, talk about the weather. It's late at night. It's dark and stormy, heavily obscured. So this makes it even harder for the players as an adventurer if you're not able to see more than 10 paces ahead of you, and your light sources are muffled and muted and indistinct. It makes it even more scary because you never know what you're gonna plunge into. You don't know what you're gonna get yourself involved in. Yeah, so there's powerful gusts of wind as well. So this is a little bit of an environment effect I decided to put in to make it harder for people who can fly. And there were quite a few characters that could fly in older seasons in D&D for Adventures League. So this helps to ground them and makes it difficult for them to easily evade this place or escape or uh, end up, not participating in the adventure. They have no justification to participate in the adventure if they can simply, fly away from any potential dangers that they may face. So having these storm winds being so powerful, it grounds them, makes it difficult for them to fly. So this takes away one of the elements that might make the story, go too easily for the players and encourages them to be creative. So other things like this, sights and sounds. The broken guidepost I decided to use for the Waystop is a little bit of a literary or a creative device, um, similar to a script writing concept called the Chekhov's gun. So if you reveal something in the story, there's a good chance that you want to use that again in later scenes. And in this case, the broken guidepost, this is a pretty important aspect of the story because why? If you take a look at the at what's on the guidepost, it says here, Cutter's Crossing gives a date and gives a population. And this number, the population, is going to come in handy later on. This is something that I often remind game masters to use to help add an extra dimension when they're running the Waystop. So we move on. We talk a little bit about the Cutter's Lodge and Trading. This is a main building in the Waystop that the participants in the adventure will be holed up in. And there's a bit more foreshadowing here as well. There's a bit more telegraphing of important elements of the story. So you have things like the draft horses who are wet and miserable and hitched to a post in the stable. There's a wagon, and of course, we have all the NPCs. So I won't talk too much about the NPCs right now. I'm gonna jump into other elements of talking about the Waystop, but the NPCs are what really drives the story. So remember, I was saying that you want to write compelling and interesting characters. So if you want to write compelling and interesting NPCs to make the story go along better, to make the players feel for the NPCs, feel for the characters, you definitely want to describe the NPCs in great detail. Okay, I'm gonna just grab a bit of water off the side. All right, so let's take a quick look at some of the NPCs, and I'm gonna just skip all the way to the end to the appendix called the Dramatis Personae. So for writers, I think this is really important, creating compelling characters. And you definitely want to have good character descriptions. You want to talk about their motivations. What do the characters want? Do they have a secret? And let's not forget as well that you want to infuse the characters with some personality. So all this is really, really quite handy when you are writing a D&D adventure, and I think that cannot be underestimated. So yeah. So I suppose that for the Waystop, I think the most important thing about it is the sense of horror that's conveyed, because the creatures are kind of not the mainstay of the adventure. So the supernatural elements, the horror elements, they're not the mainstay, but rather there's a lot of layers to it. There's all the NPCs that you get to interact with, and the NPCs are also pretty essential. Okay, I see that there's some talk about rules and rules interpretations in the stream chat. So I'm gonna just take a quick look at that. So Paladin Smites are by default, according to the raw of the text, you need to use a weapon, because it says that it adds your weapon damage. It lets you add the smite damage to your weapon damage. And an unarmed attack is not listed as a weapon in the traditional sense, because it does not appear on the weapon table in Chapter 5 of the Player's Handbook. But if you wish to rule that an unarmed strike is okay in your home game, and I think that there's not a big deal if you do that in your home game, but in Adventurers League, that is a bit iffy. Yeah, so adding to the weapon damage is the main point of contention here. So that can be a little bit challenging, but let's talk a little bit about how you can technically, get around that if you were a Path of the Beast barbarian and you were using your rage to create, claws, for example. You could technically, by the strict interpretation of the text, use your claws to smite, because your claws are described as weapons. So it's really fascinating, but it's really one of those little points of contention where it comes to rules interpretation in the Paladin Smite, that you as a DM for your home game can always choose to rule, in favor of your players, and that's perfectly okay, and that's great. I see we have a couple more people join us. Hello, welcome. Good to have you with us right now, and definitely excited to see who's joined us. Okay, I see that we have a couple more people jumped in. And we were just chatting a little bit about how I used some elements of horror to write the Waystop. And if you have any questions for me, if you have played the module before, if you are curious about my design process, rather than having me ramble on and on about it, feel free to ask questions. I'm happy to take any questions. If you want to just shoot the breeze, talk about D&D stuff. Today we're talking about writing for horror adventures because we are coming up to Halloween, and I'm sure everyone wants to tell a horror story or two during this period. I would say that yes, getting a writer to actually write is horror in and of itself because procrastination is ever the habit of a writer. And there's no bigger horror than seeing your deadline 24 hours away and having a blank manuscript. Now that is horrifying. And then you're forced to write and, churn out something that's really good and submit it before the deadline. I know this because I have had to do this very, very often. I have a very bad habit of procrastinating till the 11th hour when it comes to writing my manuscripts because I like playing through, things in my head. I like structuring my stories, planning the scenes as we go along. Hey June, yeah, I would say writing an original horror adventure is actually surprisingly easier, curiously enough. If with the right kind of inspiration, I would say you can, and if you are, kind of fairly aware of the genre conventions and the tropes that go into a horror story, you could probably piece something together. Yeah, so it would not be too tough, but rather adapting something means that you have to be, I suppose, respectful of the source material. You would have to be as accurate to the source material as possible. That could add another extra layer of pressure to you as a writer. So you're going to have a harder time developing a story that's as close to the source material as possible. But if you were to, happily just put your own spin to things, there are a lot of things, a lot of folklore, a lot of mythological monsters and creatures that you could draw upon. There could be a good starting point. It could be a good basis. In fact, one of the little processes that I like to do is to look at a monster manual or look at one of the monster books and just pick a creature that I think will be thematically appropriate and write a story around it. And if anyone on chat right now would like to pick a creature out of the monster manual, we can do a little bit of a creative exercise. Yeah, very good. Well done. That is absolutely true. If you'd like to pick out one of the creatures from the monster manual or Volos or Mordenkainen's tome, right now, we can create a short scenario specifically around the creature. So this is one of those little things we can do as well. How to write for kids horror D&D. Let me just take a quick look at that. So Ting had a question on how to not overwrite and be too descriptive, not to be too. That's not. Yeah, that's definitely something to think about. I think you want to have enough material in your manuscript so that the DM can have something to work with. They have something that they can use to paraphrase, something that gives them a good idea of setting the scene. But you don't want to use, super big words or, be too, I guess, verbose about things. You don't want to write sentences that are overly long. You don't want to write overly complicated sentences, because why I think a lot of the DMs, when they pick up a module, when they pick up an adventure, they kind of want to add their own slant to the story so they can tell the story in their own way as well. And the modules are typically just used as a starting point for them. And this is something I've come to discover over the years, because I've been invited by DMs to sit down for some of their games when they run my adventures, and I realized that hey, they don't need to use everything in the content. They use what is just necessary for their table, and that's perfectly okay. So you can just pare down your writing later on to make it more succinct, yeah, to make it more concise. And conciseness is one of the skills you'll pick up as you go along as a writer. You get better the more you practice. Yeah, right. Drunk, edit, sober. I know for a fact I used to write drunk a lot, and I would turn out some of my best or perhaps worst work, and then I'll wake up in the morning and say, hey, what the hell did I write? And but at the same time, that used to churn out a lot of interesting ideas for me as well. So I had a lot of stories that I could develop from that were great. Okay, let's not talk about my Chuni days back when I was in poly. Yeah, so yes, I've been there, done that. The whole drinking wine on rooftops, watching the sunrise, kind of thing. But I think with children's horror stories, it's a little different. You definitely don't want to talk too much about the gore or the or some of the more creepy aspects. Um, you want them to be creative and imaginative, and to use what they know to enhance the scares, I suppose. And writing for D&D adventures for children is a completely different topic entirely. My audience primarily are I guess slightly more mature audience, because of the themes that I touch on. So I would say that I'm not the best person to talk about writing for kids, but I think that there are some excellent examples of D&D adventures for kids on DM's Guild. So there's a series called the Muck series, and that's great for kids. So that's a great entry point for D&D for kids, and I would strongly encourage taking a look at that. So yeah, if anyone has any other questions, please feel free to ask. We have a lot of time today to chat, and like I said, we are talking about horror right now. You know what? I'm just gonna go quickly. I'm not gonna. I am not going to confirm or deny that. So, if we want to take a look at, say, one of the creatures in the monster manual, perhaps we can talk about how we can work around that. So maybe I'll take a look at okay, what's one of my favorite undead creatures? Bone Claw. There we go. So the Bone Claw is a good example of a D&D creature. And if you want to use the Bone Claw, you can think about the lore behind the Bone Claw, about how it kind of imprints itself to a master. The Bone Claw can make an excellent scary monster type creature, maybe a killer type monster. If you want to go for the killer and monster subgenres of horror, you can focus on that. So, oh, there we go. So I have some books here. I can just flip through. As you can see, the Mord's book and the monster manuals here as well. So I'm gonna flip through them. And if you think about the Bone Claw is a great way to tell a story about, say, people going missing in the woods, right? People disappearing because of because they are being taken away by this creature, this supernatural creature, and all that the victims see, the last thing that the victims see, are the bloodied claws of these creatures as they're taken somewhere. So the bone claw is here. I'm just gonna show the page. This is the bone claw. So this is from Mords. And the bone claw has several powerful abilities that are really interesting to use in telling a horror story. So they have things like the piercing claws that deal a significant amount of damage and can grapple someone. So this is great. Imagine if the player characters or the NPCs that they're escorting are just dragged up into the trees because a large, massive claw just comes down from up above and impales them through the chest and pulls them up. And then they have an ability called Shadow Jump, which lets them teleport away after causing a burst of necrotic damage. So this is really fun. And they can bring whoever they have grappled along. So imagine the Bone Claw stalking the players, stalking the NPCs they're escorting in this dark forest or this abandoned necropolis in the Underdark. And it's brilliant. So this is just using a single monster, a single creature. The Bone Claw, by the way, is CR 12, so you can use this in a tier 2 adventure. And it's a perfect example of a monster that is viable for a horror story. And you can just build a horror story around that, and it will kind of work. So Raziel said, scariest thing is the unknown, since D&D makes you work with specific creatures. How do you make them scarier? I would say the best way or the best type of scary monster in D&D is the monster that is seldom seen, seldom heard, and a lot of your activities that they do take place off the screen. Because what you want to do with a horror story is to tell a story where the players are the ones that are frightened exactly of the unknown. If the monster is working behind the scenes, if the monster is often not seen by the characters, but things are happening anyway, it's going to build up their paranoia, it's going to build up their fear. Another kind of creature that might be great for this at lower levels, in fact, tier 1, I would say would be the Intellect Devourer. So the Intellect Devourer is an excellent source as a tier 1 monster or tier 1 villain in a horror story. Why? Because they have this ability that lets them take over the bodies of any creature whose brains they devour. So they can teleport themselves into the brain case or into the skull of a creature whose brain they have devoured and reduce their intellect to 0. So that's great. And once they take over the body, they can pilot it as if it were a puppet. So they can just pretend to be the person, and no one would be any wiser. And that's great stuff, right? So you could have this brain-sucking serial killer on the loose in a small, remote town who hides in the bodies of his victims and changes bodies every few days, and that's why they're never caught. And that is perfect. And how are the players going to get, into the act? How are the players going to be able to discover this? Perhaps they stayed the night in the town. Perhaps they were delivering something to the town and they discovered that, bad stuff had happened. And yeah, so you just need to conceal the fact that there's an Intellect Devourer. Maybe the person that they meet for the first time in the inn, this affable chap called Jasper the Bard, is actually an Intellect Devourer possessed body. No one knows any the wiser because, for all appearances and purposes, Jasper the Bard is this nice, kindly, rather affable bard. A little bit fail, not very good at playing the lute, and but nonetheless very, very friendly. Buys the players a drink the first time they're in town. And that's great. So what you want to do with horror stories as well, definitely set the scene, tease enough information for the players to act upon, and it kind of works. Yeah, so that's going to be helpful. So use your environment, use your surroundings, describe what the players see, give them interesting cues they can work off. So in the Waystop, for example, I made it very clear that there were several elements that were kind of out of place, like the guidepost was one. That's a good hint. There's a lot of terrain and a lot of features of the environment that hint that something bad is happening as well. We have mirrors and windows that are smashed. We have dilapidated surroundings. We have some nicely telegraphed bits of information. And of course, you can always have one of the NPCs also be the person revealing essential information. And the more innocent the NPC is, the more unreliable the NPC that reveals this bit of information is, the better. So that's also great for horror as well. And it also, comes down to one of the horror tropes where it's often the person that's disbelieved actually knows what is going on. So it could be someone who's described as the outcast in the town who's onto something, or it might be the person who's seen to be not very reliable, not very ditzy, or very ditzy, the town drunk, or the local village idiot, so stuff like that. They might know something, or it could be someone who's unwanted race. Would you trust a halfling? Would you trust a gnome? I wouldn't trust a gnome as far as control one. So that's it. So think about that. So that's one of the ways that you could add more layers to the story as well. So that could be really helpful. Anyway, I'm going to just share a little bit of stats as well right now. So in the past couple months, while we have been, running the Waystop and speaking with DMs who have run the Waystop, we've managed to get some useful and interesting facts and figures. So I'm going to just share them a little bit now. I'm going to just talk a little bit about them. I think this might be interesting if you like facts and figures, if you like stats. And here we go. So I think it's no surprise that I build the Waystop as a story of multiple endings. There are 8 possible endings in all. And these are some of the numbers that we got from our survey. So most players who participated in the Waystop, about 58% of them, and this is from about 100 plus runs. Yeah, so about 58% of them got the normal end. Hey Trombe, good to have you with us. Yep, so the normal end had some of the NPCs survive, and the player characters fled the Waystop together with the NPCs. So this is a normal end, kinda. So it wasn't too bad. And then, of course, we had the bad end, where all the NPCs died and the player characters fled the Waystop. That was about 23% of the runs. So not the best results. The worst end, of course, is when everybody dies. And that's usually not what we want in a horror story. But it does happen. So all the NPCs died and all the PCs, all the player characters, they wiped 15% of the runs. There was a reasonably small percentage, about 4%, who managed to get all the essential NPCs survive and all the player characters also survived. Just 4%. And there is one very specific way to play the Waystop, and I have never seen anyone manage this because it takes a lot of resources, a lot of effort to make this happen, where you have all the NPCs survive, all the player characters survive, and you also manage to remove the Intellect Devourer from Eliza and restore her to her original state. So that is the hardest to do, the hardest to accomplish. And so far, no one has gotten that yet. But that's kind of to be expected because you kind of need a 5th level spell to do that. Yes, that is correct. Absolutely correct. Greater Restoration. And I mean, if there might be 1 or 2 players who might have a Greater Restoration scroll on their character, but they'll have to, make some rolls, make some checks to be able to cast it. So that can be a bit iffy. So not the easiest. But that's the one way to get everyone to survive and to ensure that you get rid of the Intellect Devourer, which is great. Yeah, so interesting figures, I would say, because the normal end, there are about maybe 4 normal ends, so varying different NPCs surviving will lead to a different conclusion. And of course, that's what we kind of like about, or that's what I kind of enjoy about writing more open-ended stories, more sandboxy style adventures, having different types of endings for different characters. Yeah, this is spoiler friendly, so no worries. How do most parties keep Gunther alive? Actually, that's an interesting question, and I'm going to come to that in a little bit because I'm going to share the next page of stats, and that talks about Gunther as well. So if you look at this, Gunther is the top NPC to die in every run. In 96% of the runs, Gunther always dies. So one of the best ways to keep him alive is to make sure that you're always with him or there's someone accompanying him at all times. Because why? Shade rules exist. So in the Waystop, we have the Shade rules, which are really rules of engagement for the supernatural creatures that are hounding the adventurers and the NPCs. And I think it's important to have these rules of engagement. I'm going to talk about the rules of engagement in a little bit. I'm just going to jump over from this massive pile of stats. Once I'm kind of done, just quickly scrolling through them. And we'll talk a bit about the shade rules that I designed and the principles behind why I designed the shade rules. So just a quick one, as you can see, fastest runtime for the Waystop 45 minutes. They wiped, predictably, because they decided to aggro everything. So Gunther dies often. Bernadette, poor Bernadette, dies 87% of the time. And of course, her killer, Joachim, escapes 91% of the time. Wow. So, in fact, in the most recent run of the Waystop I did, the players actually helped Joachim. They encouraged him to barricade the doors of his room because there are strange things afoot. And they trusted him so completely, he had no trouble getting away whatsoever. So number of times Kachua, the Intellect Devourer, was exposed was only 5%. So only a very nominal number of runs they discovered Kachua. Some of it was because Bernadette after Bernadette and Gunther died, the next one to go was Eliza. So Kachua ran away. And they saw Kachua running away, or they may have ended up sleeping through the night, and then we went to one of the scenes where they would end up encountering Kachua because of that. So that's one of the few times that Kachua was discovered, but that was only 5%. Most people playing through the Waystop never even realize that Eliza is an Intellect Devourer's meat puppet, and that's great because, like I said, you don't need to reveal all your cards as a DM, and not all the horror elements need to be on the table. 5% of the time, the players found the Lantern of Revealing and used it, and of course that triggered all sorts of nastiness, but that was also fun. And I guess unfortunately because Timotheus as designed, he's a child, and it's very often that the player characters will discount children. And true enough, 63% of the runs, they disbelieved Timotheus or didn't pay too much attention to him, and that led to bad stuff as well. So as you can see, remember I was saying how um, sometimes uh, the character most in tune and aware tends to be the one that the players will discount the most often, or in movies, the one that the characters, the main stars, will discount the most often. And in this case, it's Timotheus. So this falls into place as well. Yeah. So let me quickly just finish up here before we go over to talk about the rules of engagement and the shape rules. Um, Splitting the party, common in horror stories. If you split the party, bad stuff happens. 71% of the players of the Waystop like splitting the party for some reason or the other. The outhouse is a really popular ambush location. Uh, there's a lot of characters that fall victim at the outhouse because they like to go to the toilet on their own for some reason or the other. Um, Second top ambush location is the cellar. So this is also a fairly popular location for them to just sneak off on their own if they want to go sniffing around on their own. Bad stuff happens. Rogues. It's always the rogues. 23% of the victims, 23% of the casualties were rogues. So that is fantastic. You would think that rogues are a little more cautious and careful, but I guess not. And uh, there were also times when the players decided to be murder hobo and killed all the NPCs, and then bad stuff happened. And there were also four characters that ended up either getting knocked out or going unconscious, and then Kachua took their bodies and ran away. So that was hilarious. So four people uh, got their bodies snatched, and that was kind of cute. So alignment, any non-evil, is something that we try to encourage in Adventures League, but let's just say that there are many chaotic neutral players and chaotic neutral characters. So yeah, so let me just go pull up the Waystop manuscript and talk a little bit about the rules of engagement, like I was chatting about just now. So these are quite important to the story. Let me just put it up on screen so that it can be seen. There we go. So these are the shade rules that I wrote into the Waystop, and I felt that it was quite important to basically design these rules to ensure that the players and the DM had a good indicator of what to expect. And the shade rules were definitely something that the DM should know and the players should find out. So this is something that's not for the player's eyes most of the time. You want to keep the secrets of the shade rules close to your chest. And for the most part, the players should be able to infer this on their own. And I guess if you were someone who plays Among Us, you would kind of find that some of the concepts are kind of familiar as well. And it's not unexpected because these are also common horror genre conventions, right? So if a character is in close proximity to their companions, it's going to be tough for the monster to attack them. So the first rule here says they will not attack character unless the character is alone or out of sight of their companions. So this way, only characters that have gone off on their own to do whatever it is that they do in horror movies um, or when they're going out of their way to look for trouble, That's when the Shades attack. The Shades are afraid of light, so they will not attack in areas of bright light. And note here that it mentions specifically bright light. So if it were in dim light, they can attack you. So that's something to be careful about. So if they had, say, the light spell, the light cantrip, generally a useless spell in most circumstances, and very few people pick that up in Adventurers League because everyone has dark vision, or so they think, or they may have some ways of getting superior vision like Devil's Sight perhaps. So they don't usually pack the light cantrip. And most player characters end up not packing torches or lanterns as well. So because they have dark vision or some way to see in the dark. And that makes them prime candidates to be attacked by the Shades because they're not in the area of bright light, which will protect them absolutely from the Shades. So there's this exception here. So if a character decides that, say, hey, I see those things, and there are those weird things in the corner, the Shades are going to attack. Or if they attack the Shades on their own first, then the Shades will do the same. And how do they know? It's because when the Shades and a character meet their gaze. So characters can try to pretend that they don't see anything. So in horror stories, this is a prime example. What are you usually warned about in horror stories? If you see something terrible happening, keep quiet, hide, cover your mouth, right? Don't show that you know what's happening. Don't show the murderer or the monster or the creature that you're aware of their presence. But no, most players have a bad habit of yelling out, "Help! Help! There's a monster here in the corner. Help! Help! There's this mysterious supernatural entity in the corner. Help! Help! I see a murderer." Right? So that's bad stuff. Don't alert them. Otherwise, they're gonna attack. They're gonna try to silence you as quickly as they can, so they can continue killing more people. So similarly, the creatures can use the environment to create distractions and turn off non-magical light sources. And these are ways that can add to the horror of the scene as well. So say, for example, your character was holding onto a lantern or a candlestick and exploring the basement of the inn. And then suddenly someone blows out the candle and you're in complete pitch black darkness. And then you get ambushed and you get ganked. Because that would totally happen. Blind fighting is really useful. It's a fairly new addition to the rule set because of Tasha's. So this was written pre-Tasha's. And curiously enough, very few people actually take blind fighting for some reason or the other at low levels. So that's kind of cute. But blind fighting will totally be useful here. Admittedly, if they decided that, hey, there's a supernatural presence around me, and they start, yelling out about it and swinging their weapons left and right, they're probably going to attract the attention of more than one of those creatures. Yeah, blind fighting plus fog cloud is not a bad choice. Mechanically, a very decent choice. So yeah, so these are some of the shade rules that I just talked about and that I used as part of the storytelling, and I think that they're good to know, good to have. And what we just covered was basically a little bit of my my reasons for having the shade rules in place, so that you could make things a little bit more balanced, even things out, and encourage the players to be creative in their interpretations and their uses of the rules as well. So once they infer and determine the shade rules, it makes dealing with the creatures a lot easier. So we're maybe about 10 or so more minutes to go before I wrap up the stream today. Um, how often did Joaquin get captured or put down by players? I would say that like I shared just now on the I guess in the stats, Joaquin got away 91% of the time. So about 9% of the time, they managed to thwart Joaquin. So most of the times when Joaquin was thwarted was when the players decided to be a little funny. In fact, one of the earlier runs I did for the Waystop, the players decided to gate crash the couple having their own little bit of quiet time in the suite upstairs. So so they kicked down the door and harassed the couple until the couple was forced to come downstairs. And because of that, they managed to avoid Bernadette getting killed off at the Waystop. But Bernadette probably met a grim fate as well because they let Joaquin and Bernadette head off on their own after everything was over. So the couple continue on their journey, and chances are bad stuff happened after that off screen. By comparison, there was a party as well that reported how they managed to catch Joaquin in the act because the rogue happened to want to spy on the two of them. And another one was spying on a couple using an owl familiar. So they managed to notice Joaquin slipping the poison into drink and feeding that to Bernadette. So they managed to come in and thwart him that way, but he ran away. So most of the time, yeah, the lock trap is a little something that, let's just say I learned it myself when I was when it's just a little bit of in real life knowledge that I decided to incorporate into the writing. So I figured, hey, this is a great addition to the story. So if you put something small into one of those locks, um, and if someone's trying to force the lock open or whatever, it'll fall out, and it will make a noise. So that's good for yourself. It's good to know, good info, right? So yeah. Incidentally, I also had some people asking me about Joaquin as well, and in more recent runs, I've also had both um, fans and those who have purchased the Waystop from DM's Guild talking about using Waystop as a way to bridge their games into Ravenloft, into Curse of Strahd. And I've decided to do something a little bit about that as well. I'm going to just summarize that. Um, I'll just summarize that real quick as well and share that with everyone on the stream. So if you are thinking of using Waystop instead of Death House to start off your Curse of Strahd games, you can consider this. So these are some of the options you can do. So this will typically happen during the normal end. So because if you manage to get a good, the good end or the true ending, or you're otherwise successful, you will probably be only leaving the Waystop, bright and early in the morning, when you may have decided to put all the spirits to rest by burning down the house or whatever, right? But if you were fleeing the Waystop, if you were fleeing in a hurry in the middle of the night because bad stuff had happened, the NPCs are dying left, right, and center, and you've decided to commandeer the escape vehicle, the wagon, and hitched up one or two horses, maybe one, because Joaquin may have run away by now and stole one of the horses as well. When you're driving away from the Waystop in the wagon, maybe when you're passing one of the more, I guess, one of the more rural areas, what in the Thar, and the mist will just roll in, and spirit you away. So when you're fleeing from Cutter's Crossing, so maybe when you're passing through a valley in between some of the bluffs, and it's really late at night, it's been raining, so the mist will naturally flow in and engulf your wagon and take you away to Ravenloft, to the realm of Barovia. And typically, what will happen is that Wakim, who has surprisingly become a fan favorite NPC, Wakim would likely have fled on horseback, so that would be great. And to help to tie that into the Curse of Strahd adventure, you could have the players come across the remains of a horse. Maybe near one of the trees at the crossroads, or near the gallows, or somewhere before they hit the town of Barovia proper. And you might be able to find some of Wakim's belongings in the saddlebags. So Wakim may have been spirited away as well. Along Old Svalich Road, there's a good example. And later on, and this is something I did when I ran Curse of Strahd as well, after using the Waystop as a lead-in. I made Wakim come back as one of Strahd's underlings. So Strahd and Wakim met, and I guess Wakim was charming enough that Strahd decided to give him the gift of undeath, which was great for Wakim, right? Because Wakim's a serial murderer, and being an immortal serial murderer would be better than just being a tiefling serial murderer who's just a bard. And so once he becomes a vampire, he gets more powers. It becomes more fun and interesting to play, and you can make Wakim a minor antagonist. And this is great because later on, because if the players have an axe to grind with Wakim, if they have been very displeased with the fact that he murdered Bernadette, that he's a wanted criminal, they know that he's up to no good, they will want to take him down. And this is perfect because it ties everything neatly together. And that helps to more or less, wrap things up for the Waystop arc, when they eventually beat down Wakim, who's basically a thematically appropriate addition to any encounter as a vampire. Right? So that's great. You get some closure for that. Bernadette hopefully rests in peace, and everyone's happy. And because Wakim's such an ass, they should get good catharsis out of beating him up. So in a nutshell, this is how you can kind of use the Waystop to lead into Curse of Strahd, because it kind of works as an ongoing horror kind of thing. So I think that this will be helpful if you're thinking about that. So yeah, so that's that. So that's for this little edition, this little segment talking about Curse of Strahd. So I think we have about maybe 3 more minutes to. If you have any other questions for me before we sign off, we're talking about horror adventures, writing horror, running horror games for D&D. Stream extension. Stream extension. I suppose we could go another 10-15 minutes. Yeah, I suppose we could hit 10 o'clock. If there's any other thing about horror or writing or anything you want to chat about, let me know in chat, and I'll try to answer your questions as best I can. In the meantime, I'm just gonna grab a bit of water off the side, and we can keep talking. So how to Curse of Strahd? How to Curse of Strahd is a very broad-based question. Assuming absolutely zero prior horror media consumption, what are a couple concise resources to help better learn how to maintain proper tone. Um, well, there is a website that I would say is a decent place to start. I was gonna say TV Tropes. TV Tropes is not bad. There's also a place called No Film School, which is a website about script writing and filmmaking, and they have some good articles there about writing horror and other such concepts. And generally, once you understand the tropes and conventions, I would say it becomes a lot easier to create content and to tell stories. And as always, it's not about being in your face with horror, but with being subtle about it. So create the atmosphere first. It has to be something that creeps up on you, and it has to be something slightly unexpected. Remember that the whole idea of telling horror stories is to create a sense of dread, a sense of revulsion, a sense of constant doom and concern. And this has to be palpable in the things that you describe, the things that that the players interact with. So yeah, so definitely take a look at TV Tropes, take a look at No Film School. I think these are two good additions. There's a couple other websites I would say, and like I said, because my background is very filmmaking, script writing related, I'm definitely looking at all these places as references. And if you want to as well, I mean, movies are definitely the best choice because it's all very neatly packaged. It's very self-contained, and you can learn to appreciate um, these things as they go. So yeah, The Others is great. The Others is one of the most amazing psychological horror movies that I've ever watched. It has some supernatural elements for sure, um, but it's brilliant in the way it's executed. Event Horizon is really good as well, and I can't stress that enough. It's a cult classic. People either absolutely love it or they absolutely hate it, and I'm one of those people that absolutely love it. 28 Days Later is not a bad example of a zombie monster flick with a bit of slightly more modern elements to that because of the way that it's executed. It's a very post-apocalyptic, modern day thing. Um, if you play video games, I would say best uh one of the best horror video games I have played before was actually the series called Clock Tower. Clock Tower was about escaping from, a killer type creature, and it was executed very well. Yeah, showing my age, yes. Of course, Resident Evil series kind of horror-ish, but not quite. I really loved the Fatal Frame series as well. Fatal Frame was a really good horror video game series. Silent Hill was great in its own way. The movies not so great, but the video games were brilliant. Yeah, RE1 was acceptable, I would say. The later ones, not so much. Let me see, what else was good? What There was an excellent horror cult classic. The Haunting of Hill House. Now that was really good. And if you would like to look at some of the more, I suppose, Asian style horror movies, one of the most classic and traditional Thai horror movies was Nang Nak. And if you were looking at something a little different, there was I think it was 333 or 303, Fear, Faith, and Revenge, which was also a Thai horror movie. Um, Let me think what else. Korean horror. South Korea has some decent horror movies as well. They do very well with zombies. Train to Busan was great. If you were also thinking about something a little bit more monster horror style, South Korea had The Host, which was brilliant and very, very much well deserving of a film festival prize. So you can look into that. So that's South Korean horror. Japanese horror, they had things like, so Japanese horror has always been very much more about, a little bit of the supernatural, a little bit more on a little bit more on the scares, and of course, maybe the most popular and most well-known Japanese horror movie was The Ring series, because that was also adapted by filmmakers in the West and made it into adaptations. Yeah, and so that's something to think about. Yeah, those were good. Um, let's see, Hong Kong cinema. Hong Kong cinema, I would say personally, there were some very good, slightly campier horror stories in yeah, Kikaichi is not bad. It's not a terrible anime series. A lot of good supernatural style anime actually. Yeah, some of the yokai stuff is great. I personally enjoyed Gare Zero as well. Gare was pretty good in terms of the supernatural elements. Not so much horror, but there was some decent supernatural elements involved. Um, there was a there was a very good horror mystery, very indie, very underground anime series. Um, I think it was called Box Full of Goblins. It was a murder mystery style horror kind of thing. I don't remember the Japanese name for that, but I know that the translation was Box Full of Goblins or something of that sort. Something Hako. Ghost Hunt was not the best. It was interesting. I don't deny that, but it was not the best. Let me just try to figure out what the name of that was. Yeah, of the series. It's a really old, really old horror series. Yeah, I think it really need to go check that out. So you can think about that. Box of Goblins is not too bad. And The Shining was a classic. I kind of enjoyed it myself. It was a very good piece for film, for film studies as well. If you are interested in taking film studies, or if you were studying horror film, you will always be expected to watch The Shining. It's one of the more seminal pieces of work for that period. Yeah, so that's that. In fact, I would say that if you were looking at Chinese Ghost Story, in fact, yeah, Chinese Ghost Story was great. It was also by Sue Hark, and it was a very, very important part of Hong Kong film history. So if you notice, I talk a lot about Hong Kong film history because Hong Kong cinema is one of the topics I specialized in for Asian cinema. And if you were looking for something a little more uniquely, uh, Chinese, uniquely Asian, um, there's always the Mr. Vampire series. So it's a little bit campy. It's about those Chinese hopping vampires, but it's also a classic. And very recently, there was a Chinese anime series that um, that was very well done, and it was called Supernatural Investigation Bureau, and it really covers a lot of Chinese folklore, mythology, a little bit of the whole Taoism and supernatural aspects. It's basically Chinese anime X-Files, and it's brilliant. So that's something to think about. If you want something a bit more period style, Grandmaster of Demonic Cultivation had a lot of fairly interesting supernatural elements. So they're great. So that's something to think about. If you're looking for inspiration from the East. So yeah, Jiangshi is one of the very iconic vampire creatures from from China and Chinese stories. Yeah, if you play Darkstalkers, you will know it's Lele and Xianko the Darkstalkers, and they were Jiangshi. And or if you play Ragnarok Online, the Munak and the Bongun were kind of it's very similar to the hopping vampires as well. And if you were to look in the Ravenloft book, so it's over here. This is Van Richten's guide. You can there's some description of Jiangshi over here. This is in the chapter on this very Chinesey domain of dread. It's not the best, I would say, but it's certainly a more respectful adaptation of this domain than it was previously described in the older editions of Ravenloft. Yeah, so it's not the worst. I would say it's not the best, but there has been some effort that's put in, so I would say points for effort. But they didn't get the talisman on the forehead. They didn't get the artwork on the robes as well. So I would say that's not exactly a pass in my books. Yeah, so something to think about. So the Ravenloft book is not too bad. Some content there if you're interested in getting more horror elements into your storytelling. It's worth looking at. Yeah. So I think we have maybe about 2.5 minutes to go before we wrap up the stream. And if you were ever so inclined to take a look at the Ravenloft book, I guess, if you ever wanted to take a quick peek at it, you could always just pick it up. In fact, we have a couple of them available in our web store, so that's something to think about. Um, well, if you want to run, if you want to practice running the Waystop, I would say the best way to do that is to just keep running it. And the beauty of it is that when I designed the Waystop, I decided, hey, I want to do a horror visual novel style adventure. So the Waystop came about because I was inspired by all the visual novels I used to play. The first few stanzas of Hotel California, and also some of the more classic horror movies that I studied and analyzed and watched when I was, doing my film major. So everything just kind of came together, and we kind of worked that into the Waystop. So that's how it is. And yeah, so hopefully, if you ever want to run it, yeah, come run it on the Adventurers League Singapore server. You're most welcome to. I'm sure that there will be lots of people anxious and itching to play. Yeah, and if you're writing a dungeon craft, come run it on the server as well. And I'm certain there will be people who will love to be the first to try that out. So that'll be great. And yeah, there'll be a good opportunity to get more people, into the content as well. So that's it. All right. I hope everyone had a good time chatting today. We were just talking a little bit about writing for horror, talking a little bit about my Waystop adventure on DM's Guild, and generally just shooting the breeze, talking about other horror elements, other things that could inspire us to write horror stories, a little bit of the little tools and tips and tricks that I use when I'm writing horror as well. So so yeah, hope that everyone had a good time tuning in, and that this was a helpful stream for you, and it inspires you if you are writing your own horror stories to create more content as well. Yeah, so thank you very much. Thanks for joining us today, and I'll catch you again next week when I talk a little bit more about writing tips for D&D. I'll be chatting a little bit more about using the Adventurers League provided template, some house styles, some writing conventions for doing D&D content, doing adventures to be published on DM's Guild as well. So I'll catch you around next Monday, 8 p.m. Singapore time, and that's when we'll be chatting a little bit more about that. Come hang out whenever as well. We occasionally stream video games on this channel, as and when we decide that, hey, we're gonna take a little break for whatever we're doing, and play a bit of games. Sometimes we'll be streaming things like Genshin Impact, Magic the Gathering, Arena, maybe some Final Fantasy 14 or New World or whatever. So come hang out, yeah. So hope everyone had great time tuning in, and once again, thanks for joining me, and have a very good evening all. Cheers, and this is Jason signing off.